All right, so to use our API as the source of data for this data table, we need to provide a configuration object here. In this object, we need a property called Ajax, which is also an object with two properties. URL set to /API/customers, and data src or data source set to an empty string. What is this? Well, imagine our API responded with an object like this. In this case, the customer's property is the actual source of data. So we would set data source to customers. But in our case, the response we get from our API is an array of objects. So this array itself is the actual source of data. And our data table doesn't need to go to another object to get it. That's why we set data source to an empty string. Next, we need to specify our columns. So after Ajax, columns property, which is an array. For each column, we supply an object. And in this object, we specify various properties of that column. For example, we use the data property to tell DataTable plugin where to get data for this column. In the first column, we want to display customer's name. So we set this to name. Now with this configuration, DataTable will look at this property of the customer object and use that as plain text to render each row. But in our first column, we want to have a link that takes us to customer edit page. So we need to supply a custom rendering function. Render is a function. So this function will be called for rendering each row in the table. Now here we can add a few different parameters to control rendering. The first parameter, we call it data, which is the value of this property in our customer object. The second parameter is the type for this column. And the third parameter is the actual object or row we are rendering. We can call this customer. Now in this function, we return a string like this. Double quote, anchor href, single quote, /customers, /edit, /. Now we need to add the ID of this customer. So we can get it from this customer object. Now let's finish the href. So double quote, single quote, which is for the href, then close the a tag. Next, we add the text for this link. And we can either use the data parameter, which will be the name of the customer, or we can use customer.name. And finally, let's close the anchor. Like this. Now the second column, another object. Data should come from membership type.name, but this is not going to work because the customer objects we return from our API do not have this membership type. And that's something we're going to fix in the next step. So for now, let's just render the name. And the third column, data should come from the ID property because we're going to use this in rendering a data attribute for our button. Similar to the first column, we supply a rendering function. Here, all I need is the ID property, which we can get it from this data parameter. So we don't need to add the additional parameters like type or customer. Now again, we return a string, button, class is single quote, btn-link, and js-delete, single quote again. Now data-customer-id equals, here we add the data parameter, which is the ID of the customer. We close the button tag, set the text to delete, and /button. Pretty simple. Okay, now that we're using our API to render this table, we don't need to render the customers on the server. So we can get rid of this for each block here. But I'm going to leave the table structure as the placeholder for data table. Also, in our action, we don't need to get the list of customers because again, our data table is going to send an Ajax request to get them from our customer's API. So in Solution Explorer, open up controllers, go to customers controller, select the index action here. We don't need the list of customers. Delete, delete. And this also means back in our view, scroll up a little bit. Because we're not supplying a model, this code is going to throw an exception. Now, in this case, we don't really need this custom message if we don't have any customers. Earlier, I asked you to implement this just to get used to Razor View syntax. But in your applications, if you really want to display a custom message in case you don't have any customers, you can hook into one of DataTables events. When it fetches the customers from our API, we can check to see if there are any customers in that array. If not, we can write some jQuery code to render this custom message on the page. So I'm going to get rid of this if and else block. Select the table, cut, delete this, and paste the table here. Now let's test this. Build, back to the browser, refresh. Beautiful. Now our customers are fetched from our API. Next, I'm going to show you how to add membership type here.